You are looking at a thief, Your Honor. My daughter stole her entire empire from this family, and I am here to claim my rightful 50%. My own father, Reginald, looked me dead in the eye from the witness stand and perjured himself without blinking. I sat at the defense table next to my lawyer, Malik, feeling the cold mahogany under my fingertips. I did not scream or cry. I simply adjusted my suit and prepared to dismantle the man who gave me life. Before I share exactly how I destroyed his case and his ego in one afternoon, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight your own blood for what rightfully belongs to you. The gavel echoed through the Fulton County courthouse, but it could not drown out the sheer audacity of my father's lies. At 32 years old, I had built a commercial real estate firm from the ground up. I specialized in revitalizing neglected urban spaces in Atlanta, turning abandoned warehouses into thriving community hubs. It was grueling, exhausting work that required me to scrape together every penny I had. Yet here was Reginald dressed in a custom-tailored suit he bought using a second mortgage on my childhood home, painting a completely different picture under oath. Malik leaned over and whispered to remain calm, but I was already ice-cold. The plaintiff attorney, a shark my father had undoubtedly promised a massive payout, paced in front of the stand. He asked Reginald to explain the origins of my company. My father leaned into the microphone, his deep baritone filling the room with the same commanding presence he used every Sunday as a deacon at our church. He told the judge that he had graciously provided the seed money for my venture, taking it from a family trust meant for my older sister, the golden child who was currently sitting in the gallery nodding along. He claimed I had manipulated his finances and drained the family legacy to fund my selfish ambitions. He looked the judge dead in the eye and swore that he had liquidated his retirement accounts to save my failing company. He claimed he gave me $200,000 out of the goodness of his heart. Sitting there listening to him weave this fantasy, I remembered exactly where that $200,000 had actually gone. It had gone to pay off my brother-in-law's gambling debts so the family would not lose face in front of the congregation. I knew this because they had accidentally forwarded the bank wire receipt to my email address 3 years ago, a receipt that was currently sitting in the evidence binder right in front of me. Every word he spoke was a calculated strike designed to humiliate me publicly. Growing up, I was never enough. I was the dark-skinned, quiet girl who preferred blueprints to beauty pageants, a stark contrast to my lighter-skinned, socially adept sister, who was the reigning queen of our local community. My father had spent my entire life investing in her future while telling me to settle for whatever scraps fell from the table. When I chose to attend a state school instead of a prestigious historically black college, because I needed to work full-time to afford it, he called me cheap and an embarrassment. When I bought my first dilapidated commercial property instead of a flashy luxury car to keep up appearances, he called me a fool. Now that same fool was sitting on a multi-million-dollar portfolio, and suddenly he wanted his cut. The opposing lawyer prompted him to describe the current state of my business. Reginald scoffed, leaning back in his chair with an air of absolute superiority. "She calls it urban development," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I call it peddling rundown shacks in neighborhoods no respectable developer would touch." She was a struggling disappointment, failing at every turn. The business was bleeding cash, and I had to step in to rescue her from utter ruin. The sting of his words was meant to break me, but it only fueled the fire in my belly. Those rundown shacks he so casually dismissed were now prime real estate in the city's most rapidly growing districts. They were properties I bought for pennies on the dollar because I had the vision he entirely lacked. I had spent countless nights sleeping on an air mattress in my tiny office, eating cheap ramen, and reviewing zoning laws while he was out buying expensive dinners to impress his friends. He had never once asked about my business, never visited a single property, and never offered a dime of support. Reginald paused his testimony to look directly at me. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. It was the exact same look he gave me when I was 18, and he refused to co-sign my first apartment lease, telling me I would be crawling back to his doorstep begging for help within a month. Without my grace and financial backing, he told the judge with absolute conviction, she would be out on the streets today. I built her, Your Honor, and she repaid me by stealing what belongs to this family. The gallery murmured in shocked sympathy. I heard my sister let out a dramatic, rehearsed sigh of betrayal, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. My mother sat beside her wearing a look of pious disappointment. They had all come to watch my downfall, convinced that the sheer weight of parental authority would force me into submission. Malik leaned over, giving me a reassuring nod. He had warned me that civil litigation with family members was always ugly, but witnessing my own father perjure himself with such ease was a surreal experience. It showed a level of sociopathic entitlement I had never fully grasped until this moment. My father was not just greedy, he was deeply offended by my independence. My success without his permission or assistance challenged the core of his authority. In his mind, my wealth belonged to him simply because he had fathered me. He believed that daughters were extensions of their father's property, meant to elevate the family status and serve the golden child. He actually believed his own narrative. He assumed that because I had always been the quiet, obedient scapegoat growing up, I would crumble under the pressure of a lawsuit and hand over half of my life's work just to keep the peace and avoid public scandal. He thought I was still the terrified young woman desperately seeking his validation and approval. He thought I would cower in the face of his loud, booming voice and his threats of social exile. What he did not realize was that the girl he neglected had grown into a woman who documented every single transaction, every bank transfer, and every hostile text message he had ever sent. As he sat there spinning his web of lies for the court, I looked down at the thick binder resting on the table in front of Malik. It contained a paper trail so clear and irrefutable that it was going to destroy not only his frivolous lawsuit, but the entire fake persona he had spent decades building. I took a deep breath, letting his smirk burn itself into my memory, because I knew it was the last time he would ever look at me with such unearned confidence. Malik buttoned his suit jacket, the sound of the fabric rustling seeming to echo in the dead, silent courtroom. He did not carry a thick stack of papers or a dramatic legal pad. He held one single manila folder. The air in the room shifted immediately. My father, who had been sitting tall and broad-shouldered on the witness stand, subtly adjusted his posture. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face just moments before began to falter as Malik approached the podium with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator that had already cornered its prey. Mr. Hayes, you testified under oath that you single-handedly saved your daughter's business from financial ruin. Malik began, his voice calm and incredibly clear. You claimed you provided $200,000 in seed money to keep her from ending up on the streets. Is that correct? That is absolutely correct, my father boomed, leaning into the microphone, trying to project the deacon persona that commanded unquestioning respect every Sunday morning. I did what any loving father would do to protect his family. Malik nodded slowly, pulling a single sheet of paper from his folder. I want to take you back to October of 2014. Charmaine had just found her first commercial property in the West End, a property she secured the rights to purchase pending a standard business loan. Do you remember her coming to you and asking you to co-sign that loan? My father waved a hand dismissively, his heavy gold watch catching the fluorescent lights. I remember her coming to me with some foolish business plan. I told her I would handle the financing my way to protect the family assets. Your way, Malik repeated. He approached the clerk and handed over the document to be entered into evidence. I have here a loan application from Georgia Fidelity Bank dated October 14, 2014. It is signed by Charmaine as the primary applicant. And right below it in the section for a guarantor, there is a handwritten note. Would you read that note for the court, Mr. Hayes? My father squinted at the paper, his jaw tightening visibly. I do not need to read it. I told her the bank rates were predatory. Please read the note, Mr. Hayes, the judge instructed, peering over her glasses with a look of growing impatience. My father cleared his throat, the booming confidence suddenly absent from his voice. It says, application denied by guarantor. Applicant lacks the discipline for commercial ventures. Family funds are allocated elsewhere. Malik paced back to the defense table, his eyes locked on the witness. You wrote that, did you not? You explicitly refused to co-sign a loan that would have cost you nothing up front, stating your own daughter lacked discipline. Yet today you want this court to believe that just 1 month later you generously handed over $200,000 in cash to that same daughter you deemed undisciplined. I changed my mind! My father snapped, gripping the edges of the witness stand so hard his knuckles turned white. I saw she was drowning and I stepped in. I liquidated my assets to save her. Let us talk about those assets, Malik said, his voice slicing through the courtroom like a razor. He pulled a thicker stack of papers from the folder. You testified that you drained your retirement accounts to fund Charmaine's urban development firm. We subpoenaed your financial records from that exact quarter. I am holding the bank statements from November 2014. There is indeed a withdrawal of exactly $200,000 from your primary investment account. My father lifted his chin, looking toward the gallery where my mother and sister were sitting. Exactly. Like I said, I gave it to her. Except the money was not wired to Charmaine's business account. Malik countered, instantly raising the papers in the air. In fact, the money never touched any account associated with my client. According to these wire transfer logs, $100,000 went to a luxury event planning company in Buckhead. $50,000 went to a boutique floral designer. $30,000 to a high-end catering service, and $20,000 to a bridal boutique in Paris. The courtroom erupted into a low murmur. I kept my eyes locked on my father, watching the exact moment the color drained completely from his face. In the gallery, my sister Jasmine suddenly sat rigid, her perfectly manicured hands gripping her designer purse so hard the leather creaked. Malik leaned forward, resting his hands heavily on the podium. Mr. Hayes, isn't it true that you did not liquidate your assets to save Charmaine's business? Isn't it true that you outright rejected her plea for a co-signer because you were too busy liquidating your retirement to pay for your other daughter Jasmine's wedding? My father sputtered, his eyes darting toward his own lawyer, who was frantically flipping through his notes and avoiding his gaze. I am a provider. I provide for all my children. The funds were mingled. This was not just any wedding, was it? Mr. Hayes, Malik pressed, refusing to give him a single second to breathe. This was Jasmine's third wedding. Her third lavish ceremony, this time to a man named Preston. A wedding you fully financed while simultaneously telling Charmaine she was an undisciplined failure who would end up on the streets. Objection, relevance, the opposing counsel shouted, jumping to his feet with a panicked look on his face. Goes directly to the witness's credibility and the core of his financial claims, Your Honor. Malik fired back without missing a beat. Overruled, the judge stated, her eyes now fixed intensely on my father. The witness will answer the question. I had an obligation to maintain our family's standing in the community. My father raised his voice, the righteous indignation returning, though it now sounded entirely hollow and desperate. Jasmine was marrying into a prominent family. We had a certain image to uphold at the church and in our social circles. Charmaine was playing around in dirt and abandoned buildings. I had to prioritize the family's legacy. So you admit it, Malik said, stepping away from the podium and letting the words ring out across the high ceilings. You admit that not a single dime of that $200,000 went to Charmaine. You admit that you chose to finance a third wedding for your golden child, to maintain a social facade while actively trying to destroy Charmaine's only chance at securing a standard business loan. I never tried to destroy her, my father yelled, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff white collar. I told her she was not cut out for it. I was protecting her from bankruptcy. By denying her a signature and draining the family accounts for a party, Malik summarized flatly. A party for a marriage that, according to public court records, ended in a very messy divorce exactly 14 months later. Someone in the back of the courtroom gasped. Jasmine let out a sharp, offended noise, hiding her face behind her hands. My mother looked as though she might faint right there in the pews, her strict society lady composure completely shattered by the public airing of the family's worst-kept secrets. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of absolute calm. For years I had swallowed their insults. For years I had let them paint me as the difficult, stubborn daughter who refused to conform to their high society expectations. They had mocked my calloused hands, my late nights on construction sites, and my refusal to beg for their approval. They had sat in their sprawling suburban home funded by debt and deceit and looked down on me. Now the truth was bleeding out into the public record, completely dismantling the pristine narrative my father had spent his entire life curating. Malik turned his back to the witness stand, walking slowly toward our table. "Mr. Hayes, you came into this courtroom today, demanding a 50% stake in a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire. You swore under oath that you built my client. But the evidence shows you did absolutely nothing but stand in her way, hoard family resources for vanity projects, and leave her to fend for herself. So I will ask you one more time and remind you that perjury carries a very real prison sentence. Did you or did you not contribute a single penny to Charmaine's business?" My father looked at his lawyer, who offered no lifeline. He looked at my mother, who was staring at the floor. Finally, he looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes, only a furious, toxic resentment that I had dared to succeed without him, and worse, that I had dared to hold him accountable. "No," he gritted out the word barely passing his lips. "I did not." "No further questions, Your Honor," Malik said, taking his seat beside me. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the total destruction of my father's pride. The heavy silence in the courtroom following my father's forced confession did not last long. His attorney, a man accustomed to bullying his way out of tight corners, scrambled to his feet. His face was flushed with panicked aggression as he realized their entire narrative had just been obliterated on the public record. He slammed his hands flat on the plaintiff table, launching into a furious, desperate pivot. "Your Honor, the origin of the initial seed, money, is a minor mischaracterization of a much larger financial crime." The lawyer bellowed, his voice bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. "We are moving beyond the cash transfers. We have reason to believe that the defendant, Charmaine Hayes, fraudulently leveraged the historic Hayes family estate to secure the initial commercial loans for her business. She used generational family collateral without the knowledge or consent of the patriarch." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The Hayes estate in Savannah was not just a house. It was a sprawling property purchased by my great-grandfather during an era when Black men were rarely allowed to own land, let alone acreage of that magnitude. It was the crown jewel of our family history, the sacred ground where we hosted annual reunions, and the ultimate symbol of my father's status. The accusation that I had secretly mortgaged it to fund my company was a brilliant, vicious lie designed to completely destroy my character. Because of this egregious fraud, the lawyer continued, pointing an accusing finger directly at me. "We are filing an emergency motion to freeze all of the defendant's business assets immediately. Every corporate account, every holding company, every operating fund must be locked down today. She is a flight risk with generational capital." The strategy was obvious and ruthless. An emergency asset freeze is the nuclear option in commercial real estate. If my accounts were frozen, my active construction sites would shut down by morning. Payroll would bounce. My lenders would panic, and my multi-million-dollar empire would bleed out in a matter of weeks before we even made it to a formal trial. My father was willing to completely obliterate my business just because he could not control it. But the lawyer was not finished. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we demand that the deed to the historic Hayes estate be immediately transferred into a court-appointed protective trust to prevent her from liquidating it. And we request that this trust be managed by a licensed fiduciary appointed by the family, Mr. Preston Caldwell." Hearing that name echo in the courtroom took a special kind of audacity. Preston was Jasmine's third ex-husband, the very same man whose lavish wedding my father had funded instead of supporting my business. But the divorce had been a financial catastrophe for my parents. My father had secretly borrowed heavily from Preston's wealthy family to keep up his country club lifestyle and pay off Jasmine's mounting credit card debts. My father was utterly drowning in debt to his ex-son-in-law. Now, in a pathetic attempt to clear his own ledger, Reginald Hayes was trying to hand over our sacred family estate to an outsider, using my business as the sacrificial lamb. I glanced over at the gallery. My father had regained his arrogant posture, puffing out his chest as if he had just delivered a masterstroke. Jasmine smirked, flipping her expensive hair over her shoulder, fully believing that her ex-husband was about to become the legal gatekeeper of my downfall. My mother whispered something approvingly to her, their eyes shining with vindictive delight. They thought the sheer legal terror of an immediate asset freeze would force me to fold. They expected me to drop to my knees, beg for mercy, and hand over half of my company just to keep the lights on. Judge Sterling leaned back in her heavy leather chair. She was a no-nonsense jurist who had seen countless young developers ruined by malicious injunctions. She looked down at me from the bench, her expression tight with concern. She fully expected to see panic in my eyes. She expected me to furiously whisper to my lawyer to scramble for a defense, or to show the natural terror of a woman whose life's work was about to be locked behind a judicial padlock based on a blatant lie. Instead, I felt a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The sheer predictability of their greed was almost poetic. They were playing checkers while I had been playing chess for the better part of a decade. I did not break eye contact with my father as I raised my right hand. I let my manicured nails tap against the polished dark wood of the defense table. Click, click, click. The sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the suffocating tension in the room, drawing every eye toward me. Without rushing, I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the floor. I pulled out a single, heavy red folder. I did not look at the opposing counsel, and I did not look at the judge. I kept my gaze locked dead onto my father's suddenly faltering expression as I slid the red folder across the table to Malik. Malik did not even need to open it to know what was inside. We had anticipated this exact desperate maneuver months ago. He picked up the folder, his own smile mirroring mine, and approached the bench with a quiet, lethal confidence. "Your Honor," Malik said, placing the folder smoothly into the bailiff's hands to be passed up to the judge. The plaintiff's motion for an asset freeze based on the fraudulent leveraging of the Hayes family estate is entirely moot. Furthermore, the demand to transfer the deed into a protective trust managed by Preston Caldwell is not only legally impossible, it borders on the absurd. The opposing lawyer scoffed loudly. "It is a standard protective measure to secure family collateral from a rogue developer." "It is impossible," Malik corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm octave, "because Reginald Hayes does not own the Savannah estate. He has not owned it for nearly 7 years. Judge Sterling opened the red folder. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as her eyes scanned the certified documents. "Counselor," the judge said, her voice dripping with disdain as she looked down at my father's lawyer. "This deed was legally transferred to a holding company controlled entirely by the defendant 7 years ago. Furthermore, the records indicate the defendant purchased this estate directly from the bank after it fell into pre-foreclosure under your client's management. Your motion for an asset freeze is denied." The opposing lawyer was sweating through his expensive suit. He had billed my father for a slam-dunk victory and was currently standing in the wreckage of his own hubris. The financial claim was dead in the water. He needed a lifeline. He needed to pivot entirely to character assassination to prove I was mentally and financially incapable of running my own company without family oversight. He needed the court to believe I was a rogue, unstable variable who required my father's steady hand to survive. "The plaintiff calls Dr. Jasmine Hayes," the lawyer announced, his voice tight with desperation. Jasmine stood up from the gallery. She was wearing custom-tailored navy blue scrubs, embroidered with the gold logo of her high-end dermatology clinic in Buckhead. She had pristine white sneakers and a stethoscope draped casually around her neck. She had absolutely not come straight from work. She had deliberately chosen to wear her medical uniform to a civil trial just to remind everyone in the room that she was a doctor. She wanted Judge Sterling to see a respected medical professional, a highly educated pillar of the Atlanta community, whose word was absolute gospel. She walked past my table without making eye contact and took the oath with a practiced look of solemn duty. She sat down, adjusted her perfect hair, and folded her hands delicately in her lap. The plaintiff's lawyer approached the stand, his aggressive demeanor entirely replaced by a soft, respectful tone. He treated her like a fragile but incredibly reliable expert witness. "Dr. Hayes, Could you please describe your relationship with your younger sister? He asked sympathetically. Jasmine offered a sad theatrical smile. I have always tried to protect Charmaine, but it has been incredibly difficult. Growing up, she was always deeply unstable. She harbored this intense, irrational jealousy toward me and the rest of the family. I went to medical school, built a respectable practice, and maintained our family's standing. Charmaine always wanted what I had, but she lacked the discipline to put in the actual work. I sat at the defense table watching my sister spin her fairy tale with the ease of a seasoned sociopath. She weaponized her medical degree to diagnose me on the stand, painting my independence as rebellion and my quiet ambition as a manic episode. She told the court that my real estate firm was nothing more than a reckless gambling habit fueled by my desire to outshine her. She buys these horrible, dangerous buildings in terrible neighborhoods, Jasmine said, her voice trembling with fake concern. My father and I have spent years trying to save her from herself. We tried to guide her business decisions, but she is erratic. She makes terrible financial choices and then expects our family to clean up her messes and protect her from total ruin. The lawyer nodded as if listening to a tragic tale of familial sacrifice. Dr. Hayes, in your professional and personal opinion, is the defendant capable of managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio without your father's guidance? Absolutely not, Jasmine said firmly. She is a liability. If my father had not stepped in to manage her affairs, she would have bankrupted herself years ago. And has she recently asked you to clean up one of these financial messes, Dr. Hayes? The lawyer pressed, setting up the grand finale. Jasmine looked directly at Judge Sterling, letting a single, perfectly timed tear escape her eye. She reached up to wipe it away, ensuring the gold embroidery of her clinic's name caught the light. Yes, Your Honor. Just last month, Charmaine showed up unannounced at my clinic. She was frantic and crying. She begged me for a $50,000 loan. She said her business accounts were overdrawn, her contractors were threatening to stop work, and her entire empire was imploding. She begged us for money to keep her out of bankruptcy. The gallery let out a collective gasp. My mother nodded vigorously from the pews, validating the lie with her own performed sorrow. My father looked vindicated, sitting tall as his golden child drove the final nail into my coffin. They genuinely thought this performance would sway the judge. They thought I would snap, yell out in protest, or break down crying under the weight of such a massive public defamation. They expected the unstable, jealous younger sister to reveal herself to the court. I did none of those things. I simply smiled, picked up my pen, and wrote a single date on my yellow legal pad. I slid it over to Malik. I knew exactly where Jasmine was last month, and it certainly was not at her clinic dealing with a frantic sister. She had just handed us the rope to hang her with, and Malik was more than ready to pull the lever. Malik stood up slowly, picking up the yellow legal pad I had just slid across the table. He did not raise his voice or pace the floor. He simply looked at my sister with a mixture of pity and absolute lethal intent. Dr. Hayes, Malik said casually, you testified that Charmaine came to your Buckhead clinic last month, specifically on the 14th, crying and begging for $50,000. Is that your sworn testimony? Jasmine lifted her chin, clinging to her fragile performance. Yes, it was a Tuesday. She was completely hysterical. Malik nodded, pulling his phone from his pocket and tapping the screen. Your Honor, I would like to submit Defense Exhibit D into evidence. It is a series of date-stamped geotagged photographs from Dr. Hayes' own public social media accounts. The opposing counsel jumped up, but Malik was already speaking over him. Dr. Hayes, according to these photographs, on Tuesday the 14th of last month, you were not at your clinic in Buckhead. You were on a 2-week sponsored yacht excursion in the Amalfi Coast. In fact, in one video posted at the exact time you claim my client was crying in your office, you are holding a glass of champagne and giving a tour of your first-class cabin. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. Jasmine opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The color completely vanished from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified child rather than a respected medical professional. She looked frantically at our father, who was suddenly very interested in the scuff marks on his shoes. Did my client swim across the Atlantic Ocean to beg you for money, Dr. Hayes? Malik asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Or are you committing perjury in this courtroom today? Jasmine stammered, looking at the judge with wide, panicked eyes. Judge Sterling was glaring at her with a level of judicial fury that made the air in the room feel heavy. "Step down, Dr. Hayes," Judge Sterling commanded, her voice like a cracking whip, "and do not leave this courthouse. We will be discussing the penalties for perjury before this session is adjourned." Jasmine practically ran off the stand, her designer scrubs suddenly looking like a prison uniform. The plaintiff's lawyer was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. He had lost his financial argument, and his star character witness had just immolated herself on the stand. He had only one card left to play. "The plaintiff calls Preston Caldwell," the lawyer announced, his voice shaky. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Preston strode down the aisle. If unearned privilege had a face, it was Preston Caldwell. He was Jasmine's third ex-husband, a man born on third base who spent his entire life demanding a trophy for hitting a triple. He wore a bespoke suit that cost more than a down payment on a house, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating the casual, smug entitlement of a mediocre white man who had never been told no. He walked past my table, shooting me a patronizing little smile before taking the oath. The racial and gender dynamics in the room were palpable, thick, and suffocating. My colorist class's father had literally brought his white ex-son-in-law into a courtroom to snatch a self-made black woman's empire. Reginald believed that placing my assets under Preston's control was the only way to legitimize the family wealth. To my father, my dark skin and my independence meant my money was somehow illegitimate until a white man managed it. Preston settled into the witness chair, crossing one leg over the other, treating the witness stand like a leather armchair at his father's country club. Mr. Caldwell, the plaintiff's lawyer, began, eager to regain some footing. "Could you explain your professional background and your involvement with the Hayes family estate?" Preston leaned toward the microphone, exuding absolute arrogance. "I am a senior vice president at Caldwell Wealth Management. Reginald came to me several months ago. He was deeply distressed about the state of the family's portfolio. He asked me to step in as a consultant and audit the defendant's commercial real estate ventures to see if they could be salvaged." "And what did you find during your audit?" the lawyer prompted. Preston let out a long theatrical sigh, shaking his head as if burdened by my sheer incompetence. "It was a complete disaster. The defendant is acquiring properties in severely underdeveloped urban zones. She is over-leveraged and entirely out of her depth. Commercial real estate in Atlanta is a complex, high-stakes arena. It is not a game for an uneducated girl playing Monopoly with family funds. She lacks the sophistication and the basic financial literacy to handle real wealth." I sat perfectly still, listening to this man call me an uneducated girl on the public record. I held a double master's degree that I had paid for entirely on my own, while Preston had barely scraped through a legacy admission at a mid-tier university because his father donated a library wing. Preston continued, his voice dripping with a savior complex. "I sat down with Reginald and explained that her portfolio was a ticking time bomb. I graciously offered to fold her properties into Caldwell Wealth Management. We have the infrastructure, the education, and the pedigree to manage these assets properly. I offered to step in as the primary fiduciary to protect the Hayes family from the defendant's erratic, highly emotional decision-making. It was a generous offer, frankly, to save her from inevitable bankruptcy." He looked at Judge Sterling, flashing a brilliant, expensive smile, fully expecting her to nod along with his brilliant financial assessment. He truly believed he was the hero of this story, the sophisticated white knight riding in to rescue the poor, clueless black girl from her own success. He thought throwing around words like over-leveraged and fiduciary would dazzle the room and instantly prove his superiority. My father sat in the gallery, nodding along proudly. Reginald Hayes was actually beaming with pride as this man disrespected his own daughter, completely oblivious to the fact that Preston was insulting our entire family line by implying we needed his supervision to handle money. I did not glare at Preston. I did not cross my arms or show a single ounce of the anger boiling in my chest. I simply picked up my pen and wrote 2 words on my legal pad, sliding it over to Malik. The words were SEC investigation. Malik read the note, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He stood up for cross-examination, buttoning his jacket completely unfazed by Preston's performance. Preston had just built a massive, gleaming pedestal of unearned superiority right in the middle of the courtroom, and Malik was about to kick the only pillar supporting it straight out from under him. Malik stepped away from the defense table, leaving my yellow legal pad resting perfectly centered in front of him. He walked toward the center of the courtroom with a casual, relaxed stride. He did not immediately attack. Instead, he looked at Preston with an expression of mild curiosity, the way one might look at a loud child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. Mr. Caldwell, Malik began, his voice smooth and conversational. You have presented yourself to this court as a financial savior. You spoke at length about your pedigree and your sophisticated audits. You claim my client lacks the education to manage her own portfolio, and you are graciously offering to take the reins. Preston adjusted his expensive silk tie and leaned back. Exactly. Someone needs to be the adult in the room. I am simply trying to inject some basic fiscal responsibility into a portfolio that is currently running on pure emotion and amateur guesswork. I see, Malik said, nodding slowly as if genuinely considering Preston's words. Let us discuss this profound fiscal responsibility you are offering. You specifically demanded that the court transfer the deed of the historic Hayes estate in Savannah into a trust under your direct management. Tell the court, Mr. Caldwell, what exactly is your sophisticated, highly educated strategy for this particular property? Preston smiled, clearly thrilled to be asked about his business acumen. He leaned toward the microphone, eager to lecture the room. The Savannah estate is a prime example of the defendant's emotional, uneducated management style. It is a massive piece of acreage sitting entirely underutilized. It is a depreciating asset bleeding property taxes and maintenance costs. From a wealth management perspective, keeping it intact is absolute financial malpractice. Malik tilted his head. And your solution is what exactly? My strategy is a complete teardown, Preston stated proudly, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. The land is zoned for commercial use. I have already drafted preliminary blueprints to bulldoze the outdated residential structures and clear the surrounding acreage. We will pave the entire footprint and construct a high-yield commercial strip mall. I already have tentative letters of intent from a national pharmacy chain and 2 fast food franchises. It is a masterclass in aggressive asset maximization. The air in the courtroom grew heavy, thick, with a collective suffocating shock. The Savannah estate was not just an outdated residential structure. It was a sprawling, majestic property purchased in cash by my great-grandfather, a man who had worked his hands to the bone during an era when black men were systematically violently barred from owning land. It was a symbol of our bloodline's survival, resilience, and triumph. It was the physical embodiment of the Hayes family legacy, holding over a century of our history within its walls. And Preston Caldwell, a mediocre man, dripping in unearned privilege, was proudly announcing his plan to bulldoze it to the ground. He wanted to erase a monument of black historical triumph and pave over it to build a parking lot and a drive-through. I turned my head to look at the gallery, expecting to see my father standing up in outrage. I expected Reginald Hayes, the proud patriarch, who constantly preached about family legacy and community standing, to be red in the face, shouting at Preston for daring to suggest destroying our ancestors' home. Instead, my father was sitting in the second row, nodding along. Reginald was actually nodding his head in agreement. He was so utterly consumed by his toxic resentment toward me, so blinded by his need to see me defeated, that he was eagerly co-signing the erasure of his own grandfather's legacy. He was willing to let a privileged outsider obliterate our family history, just so he could win a petty power struggle against his own daughter. It was the most pathetic, heartbreaking display of fragile ego I had ever witnessed. Malik let the silence stretch, allowing the sheer disrespect of Preston's grand strategy to marinate in the minds of everyone present. Judge Sterling was staring at Preston with an expression of sheer disgust, her pen hovering motionless over her notes. Bulldoze a historic family estate to build a strip mall, Malik repeated softly, making sure every syllable landed with maximum impact. That is quite an aggressive liquidation plan, Mr. Caldwell. Why the sudden need for such an extreme, immediate cash grab? Why destroy a multi-million-dollar legacy property for quick franchise money? Preston sighed, exasperated by having to explain simple economics to the room. Because Reginald is drowning. He is completely over-leveraged. He came to me begging for a lifeline. Reginald currently owes my family's private lending firm over $600,000, mostly from funding Jasmine's lifestyle and his own country club debts. The strip mall development is the only way to generate the immediate aggressive cash flow required to save Reginald from mounting debts and impending bankruptcy. I am liquidating the asset to save him. A wave of loud murmurs broke out across the gallery. My mother buried her face in her hands, humiliated beyond repair. Preston had just outed my father as a broke, desperate debtor on the public record. Reginald stopped nodding. His jaw dropped as he realized his white knight had just broadcasted his financial ruin to the entire city of Atlanta. Preston did not care about Reginald's pride. Preston only cared about getting his family's money back, and he was using the witness stand to secure his payout. So let me summarize your brilliant financial strategy, Malik said, his voice now booming, carrying the full weight of a trap snapping shut. Your grand fiduciary duty is to bulldoze a historic black landmark, pave over a century of family legacy, and sell it to a fast food chain just to pay off a personal debt Reginald owes to your own family. You are using this courtroom to execute a hostile debt collection under the guise of wealth management. Objection! The plaintiff's lawyer shouted, his voice cracking. Counsel is badgering the witness. I am establishing the witness's true motives. Your Honor. Malik shot back, never taking his eyes off Preston. And I am establishing his pattern of fraudulent financial practices. Malik walked back to our table and picked up the yellow legal pad where I had written those two crucial words. He turned back to Preston, whose smug smile had finally begun to crack at the edges. Mr. Caldwell, you have boasted endlessly today about your pedigree, your education, and your firm's infrastructure, Malik said, his tone turning lethally sharp. Tell me, does that infrastructure include the federal agents who raided your offices last Tuesday? Is this aggressive liquidation strategy similar to the creative financial maneuvers that caught the attention of the Securities and Exchange Commission? Preston froze. The color drained from his perfectly tanned face. His hands gripped the railing of the witness box as if the floor had just dropped out from under him. Yes, Mr. Caldwell. Malik continued, holding up a certified document for the court to see. We pulled the public filings. Caldwell Wealth Management is currently under active federal investigation by the SEC for defrauding clients, misappropriating funds, and running an illegal Ponzi structure. You are not a white knight coming to save this family. You are a desperate, federally investigated fraudster trying to steal my client's multi-million-dollar estate for a quick cash grab to pay your own legal fees before you end up in federal prison. The heavy wooden gavel slammed against the sounding block with the force of a gunshot. Judge Sterling demanded order, her voice cutting through the chaotic murmurs that had erupted across the gallery. The entire courtroom had just watched the polished veneer of Preston Caldwell shatter into a million jagged pieces. He stood in the witness box, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden railing, breathing heavily through his nose. He forced a breathy, nervous laugh and attempted to wave away the federal investigation document Malik had just presented. That is nothing but a routine compliance inquiry, Preston stammered, frantically adjusting his expensive silk tie. It is a completely baseless fishing expedition launched by a few disgruntled former clients. It has absolutely no bearing on my professional capacity to act as a fiduciary for the Hayes family estate. Judge Sterling slowly removed her reading glasses and set them down on her desk. She leaned forward, her dark eyes pinning Preston to his chair. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mr. Caldwell! Judge Sterling began, her tone dangerously quiet and utterly devoid of patience. You came into my courtroom demanding that a historic multi-million-dollar property be placed into a protective trust under your exclusive control. You outlined a highly aggressive plan to demolish that property. You claim this development is already in motion and that you have secured letters of intent from national corporate chains. She paused, letting the severity of her words hang in the air. To execute a demolition and commercial redevelopment of that magnitude, you must possess the original deed, or have verified unassailable legal authority to act upon it. I am asking you a direct question, Mr. Caldwell. Do you have the original deed to the Savannah estate? Preston swallowed hard. He looked out at the gallery, his eyes darting toward my father. Reginald was sweating profusely, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. Preston had a choice to make. He could admit he had never actually seen the physical deed and lose his entire legal standing, or he could double down on his arrogance and assume he could lie his way past a seasoned judge. He chose arrogance. He smoothed his jacket, lifted his chin, and put that unbearable smug smirk right back on his face. "Yes, Your Honor," Preston stated, his voice ringing out with manufactured confidence. "Reginald physically handed the original deed over to me 2 months ago as collateral for his outstanding debts to my firm. It is safely locked in the primary security vault at Caldwell Wealth Management." Malik didn't even wait to be recognized. He stands up, his voice echoing in the courtroom. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is committing perjury. The bank doesn't have the deed." The plaintiff's attorney leaped up from his chair, his face purple with rage. "Objection. Defense counsel is testifying and making wild, unsubstantiated accusations." Judge Sterling ignored him completely. She kept her eyes locked on my lawyer. "Explain yourself, counselor, and you had better have proof." Malik walked smoothly to the center of the floor. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a pristine, heavy parchment envelope. He did not rush. He unsealed the envelope and extracted a thick, multi-page legal document bearing a raised golden seal and a vivid blue county watermark. "What you see here, Your Honor," Malik said, holding the document high for the entire courtroom to see, "is the original certified deed to the Savannah estate. My client has kept this exact document in a private safety deposit box under her holding company for the last 7 years. It has never left her possession. It has never been used as collateral for Reginald Hayes. And it is certainly not sitting in a vault at a federally investigated wealth management firm." Preston's face turned a sickening shade of gray. His smug smirk vanished, replaced by absolute, unadulterated terror. "That is a lie," my father roared, leaping up from the second row of the gallery. "I gave him the deed. I handed it to him in his office." The entire courtroom descended into absolute madness. Reginald had just screamed a confession out loud in a court of law. He had just admitted to attempting to trade away a property he did not legally own to settle his personal gambling debts. And Preston had just been caught lying under oath about possessing a document that was currently sitting in Malik's hands. Judge Sterling slammed her gavel repeatedly, threatening to hold the entire gallery in contempt and have the bailiffs clear the room. The noise instantly died down, leaving only the sound of Preston's ragged, panicked breathing. "Bring that document to the bench," Judge Sterling commanded. Malik approached and handed over the deed. The judge inspected it thoroughly. She ran her thumb over the raised county seal. She checked the date, the signature, and the transfer of ownership records. Everything was flawless. Everything proved that I was the sole undisputed owner of the land they were trying to steal. Judge Sterling looked up, her expression turning to absolute ice. "Mr. Caldwell, you are under oath. You just looked me in the eye and testified that the original deed was locked in your bank's vault. Yet I am holding the original authenticated document in my hand. Would you like to explain yourself, or should I have the bailiff take you into custody for perjury right this second?" Preston was completely trapped. He stammered, looking wildly at his lawyer for a lifeline, but the plaintiff's attorney had backed away from the table, physically distancing himself from his own witness. Preston looked at Reginald, but my father was glaring at him with pure, venomous hatred. The unholy alliance between the arrogant patriarch and his fraudulent white knight shattered in real time. They had turned on each other like starving wolves caught in a trap. I sat at the defense table with perfect posture, watching their empire of lies collapse into dust. I did not feel pity for my father. I did not feel an ounce of remorse for my sister, who was shrinking into her seat trying to hide her face from the public disgrace. I felt the profound electric vindication of a daughter who was thrown to the wolves and returned to the courtroom leading the pack. They had underestimated my intelligence, mocked my ambition, and tried to strip me of everything I had built. Now they were going to lose everything they had left. Judge Sterling did not have Preston arrested on the spot, though the promise of a perjury charge hung over his head like a guillotine. She ordered him to step down and return to the gallery, instructing the court reporter to flag his entire testimony for review by the district attorney. The plaintiff's lawyer, pale and trembling, hastily announced that they had no further witnesses. They were done. Their grand offensive had collapsed into a spectacular pile of federal investigations and easily disprovable lies. The defense calls Charmaine Hayes. Malik announced, his voice steady and resonant. I stood up from the heavy oak table. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored emerald green blazer, feeling the crisp, structured fabric against my shoulders. I did not rush. I walked toward the witness stand with the measured, unbothered stride of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. The clicking of my heels echoed in the cavernous room, a sharp, rhythmic sound that forced every eye to follow me. As I stepped up into the box and raised my right hand, I looked directly into the gallery. My father was slouched in his seat, the pompous patriarch completely deflated. Jasmine refused to meet my gaze, staring fixedly at her expensive handbag. I placed my left hand on the Bible, looked the clerk in the eye, and swore to tell the whole truth. When I sat down, I finally locked eyes with Reginald. I did not glare. I did not scowl. I gave him a look of absolute chilling indifference. Please state your name and occupation for the record. Malik began, standing casually by his podium. Charmaine Hayes. I answered, my voice projecting clearly through the microphone. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Urban Development, a commercial real estate firm based in Atlanta. Malik nodded. Ms. Hayes, we heard extensive testimony today about your supposed lack of education and financial literacy. Could you briefly outline your academic and professional qualifications for the court? I hold a Bachelor of Science in Finance and a dual Master of Business Administration and Urban Planning. I stated, enunciating every syllable. I graduated with highest honors, paying my own tuition through academic scholarships and working 3 jobs simultaneously. Following graduation, I spent 5 years as a senior analyst at a top-tier commercial real estate brokerage before striking out on my own. I did not require a wealthy spouse to secure my position, nor did I rely on a legacy admission. I earned my credentials through sheer grit. Judge Sterling leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, her eyes fixed intently on me. The contrast between my calm, verifiable facts and the hysterical, desperate lies of my family was striking. Malik approached the clerk with a new stack of documents. Your Honor, I am submitting Defense Exhibit F into evidence. These are the certified audited financial records and tax returns for Hayes Urban Development from its inception to the current fiscal year. He turned back to me. Ms. Hayes, your father testified under oath that he injected $200,000 into your business to save it from bankruptcy. Looking at your founding financial documents, can you tell the court exactly how this company was funded? I looked directly at my father as I answered. The company was founded with $47,000. That was my entire life savings. Every cent I had scraped together by living in a dangerous studio apartment, eating canned soup, and denying myself every basic luxury. There is not a single line item, wire transfer, or cash deposit in my corporate history that originated from Reginald Hayes, or any family trust. I built this empire on my own back. And what about the state of your properties? Malik asked, gesturing vaguely toward the gallery. Your sister and Mr. Caldwell described your portfolio as a collection of rundown shacks that are bleeding cash. Is Hayes Urban Development currently facing bankruptcy? I allowed myself a small, tight smile. That is a fascinating categorization of my life's work. It is also entirely false. I acquire neglected properties in historically underserved neighborhoods, yes. But I do not leave them to rot, and I certainly do not bulldoze them to build fast food chains. I revitalize them. I turn them into affordable co-working spaces, grocery cooperatives for food deserts, and community centers. Malik handed a bound presentation to the bailiff to pass to the judge. The judge flipped through the pages, her eyebrows raising as she took in the high-quality photographs and financial charts. As the court can see in the portfolio valuation report, I continued, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. My firm currently owns and manages 24 commercial properties across the metropolitan Atlanta area. Every single one of them is operating at a profit. Our tenant retention rate is 96%. Last quarter, an independent appraisal firm valued Hayes Urban Development at roughly $42 million. We have 0 delinquent loans. We have never missed a payroll. I am not a struggling, uneducated girl playing a game. I am the sole owner of a highly lucrative debt-free enterprise. The gallery was dead silent. My mother let out a small, stifled gasp. $42 million. It was a number they had never fathomed. They had spent years convincing themselves I was a stubborn failure because I refused to play their social climbing games. Hearing the actual certified value of the empire I had built while they mocked me sent a shockwave of profound regret across their faces. Not regret for how they treated me, but regret that they had not found a way to sink their claws into me sooner. Malik walked slowly toward the witness box, resting his hand on the wooden rail. Ms. Hayes, if your business is thriving, and if your father contributed absolutely nothing to your success, why do you believe he brought this lawsuit against you today? Why would he perjure himself to claim a 50% stake in your company? I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I delivered the truth with the cold, surgical precision of a woman who had finally excised a toxic tumor from her life. Because Reginald Hayes is a desperate bankrupt man, I stated clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. He has spent his entire adult life funding a facade of wealth to impress a society that does not care about him. He mortgaged his home to pay for country club memberships. He drained his retirement to fund his golden child's lavish failed marriages. And when the bill finally came due, when his creditors began knocking on his door and the threat of public ruin became a reality, he looked for a host to bleed dry. I kept my eyes locked on my father, watching him shrink into his seat under the crushing weight of the truth. He did not sue me because he helped build my company, I said, delivering the final fatal blow to his ego. He sued me because I am the only person in this family who actually has any real money. He saw my success, a success he actively tried to prevent, and felt entitled to it simply because he shares my DNA. He thought I was still the quiet, obedient daughter he could bully into submission. He was wrong. Malik allowed my words to settle over the courtroom before walking back to our defense table. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of bank records, securely bound with a heavy metal clip. He handed one copy to the bailiff for the judge and another to the opposing counsel, who looked as though he wanted to physically dissolve into the floorboards. Your Honor, Malik said, his voice ringing with absolute authority, we are submitting Defense Exhibit G into evidence. These are certified financial records detailing the recent activities of Caldwell Wealth Management, specifically regarding the accounts of Reginald Hayes. Malik turned to me. Ms. Hayes, as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar real estate firm, does your company have an acquisitions department? Yes, I answered clearly into the microphone. A significant portion of my business involves evaluating distressed portfolios and acquiring defaulted commercial debt. As part of our standard due diligence last quarter, my acquisitions team flagged a series of highly irregular financial maneuvers involving Caldwell Wealth Management. Because my father's name was attached to the collateral, I personally authorized a deep dive into the public filings. And what exactly did your acquisitions team discover regarding Preston Caldwell's management of your father's finances? Malik asked. I shifted my gaze from Malik to Preston, who was now sitting rigidly in the gallery. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows. We discovered that Preston Caldwell is not a financial genius, I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. Over the past 18 months, Preston secretly took out 3 massive collateral loans against my father's primary suburban estate. My father signed over the power of attorney, believing Preston was restructuring his debt to save him from bankruptcy. Instead, Preston used the equity in my father's home as a personal slush fund to cover his own catastrophic, reckless day trading losses. The entire courtroom inhaled sharply. I did not break eye contact with Preston as I read his financial sins into the public record. He was not executing sophisticated wealth management strategies, I continued. He was making desperate, highly leveraged margin calls on volatile tech stocks and offshore crypto exchanges. When those trades crashed, he took out a second loan against my father's house to cover the margin calls. When that failed, he took out a third. Preston lost over $2.4 million of his firm's capital. He leveraged his ex-father-in-law's last remaining asset to hide his own gross incompetence from his partners and federal regulators. Chaos erupted at the plaintiff's table. Jasmine let out a sharp, genuine gasp, her perfectly manicured hands flying to her mouth. The flawless, superior facade she had worn all morning shattered into a million pieces. She dropped her expensive designer purse onto the hardwood floor, the heavy thud cutting through the rising noise. She turned to stare at her ex-husband, her eyes wide with horrified realization. The man she had paraded around as the family's savior, the man whose lavish lifestyle my father had funded at my expense, had just robbed them blind. My father looked wildly confused for a fraction of a second before the truth finally penetrated his thick skull. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Reginald Hayes, the man who demanded unquestioning respect and submission from everyone around him, suddenly realized he had been played for an absolute fool. He had marched into a court of law to steal my hard-earned empire, completely oblivious to the fact that his chosen champion had already picked his pockets clean. Preston scrambled to his feet in the gallery, his face flushing a violent, mottled crimson. He ignored the bailiff stepping toward him and pointed a shaking finger at the witness stand. "Those were strategic family investments," Preston shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he aggressively backpedaled. "I was utilizing high-yield algorithmic trading protocols to maximize Reginald's liquidity. The market experienced unprecedented irrational fluctuations. It was a temporary downturn. Order in this court!" Judge Sterling bellowed, slamming her gavel so hard the sound cracked like a whip. "Mr. Caldwell, you will sit down and remain silent, or you will spend the next 48 hours in a holding cell." Preston ignored her, driven by the sheer terror of his impending ruin. He grabbed the wooden railing separating the gallery from the floor, leaning forward desperately. "You do not understand high-level finance," he yelled at me, entirely abandoning his polished persona. "You are a glorified landlord. I was executing complex derivatives to save this family from his debts." I let him shout. I sat perfectly still in the witness box, watching a man dripping in unearned privilege completely unravel in front of a judge, a court reporter, and the very family he had defrauded. I let him dig his grave a little deeper, letting the echoes of his pathetic defense bounce off the walls. When he finally ran out of breath, panting and red-faced, I leaned into the microphone. "There is nothing complex about gambling away $2 million on internet meme stocks, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal calm. "And there is certainly nothing strategic about defaulting on those loans." I turned my attention back to my father, who was staring at me with a look of absolute horror. "The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on your suburban home 3 days ago, Dad." I delivered the final crushing blow without a trace of sympathy. "Preston did not tell you because he needed you to win this lawsuit today. He needed you to steal 50% of my company so he could siphon off my revenue to pay back the money he stole from you. You did not bring a financial savior into this courtroom. You brought a parasite." My father slumped back into the wooden pew, all the air rushing out of his lungs. The towering, authoritative patriarch who had spent his life terrorizing me was gone, replaced by a broken man who had just lost his home, his reputation and his dignity in a single afternoon. He looked at Jasmine, but his golden child was weeping silently into her hands, entirely powerless to fix the disaster she had helped create. They had spent 32 years making me feel like an ugly, inadequate failure. They had laughed at my ambitions, denied me support, and tried to strip me of the very empire I had built to escape their toxicity. Now the natural consequences of their own greed had arrived to collect the debt. I looked at Malik, who gave me a sharp, satisfied nod. We had not just won a civil lawsuit. We had surgically dismantled a generational cycle of abuse on the public record. I let the silence hang in the courtroom for a few agonizing seconds. The revelation of Preston gambling away the family money had already shattered my father's reality, but I was not quite finished. I had promised myself I would completely eradicate the toxic foundation this family stood on. I adjusted my posture, smoothing the lapels of my blazer, and leaned into the microphone. They weren't investments, Preston. They were defaults. Preston froze. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but he had completely run out of lies to spin. I turned my gaze away from the pathetic fraudster in the gallery and locked eyes with my father. Reginald Hayes was slouched in the wooden pew, breathing heavily, his hands trembling in his lap. He thought the foreclosure process had just begun. He thought he still had time to negotiate, to leverage his social connections to somehow bully his way out of the mess. "Dad," I said, my voice carrying a cold, clinical precision. The notice from 3 days ago was not a warning. It was the final writ of possession. The bank quietly foreclosed on the estate 8 months ago. My father's jaw literally dropped. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking pale and hollow. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, trying to process the magnitude of my words. 8 months, he whispered, the sound barely carrying across the room. "Yes," I confirmed cleanly. 8 months ago. Preston routed all the official bank correspondence directly to Caldwell Wealth Management under the guise of handling your estate planning. He intercepted the default notices. He intercepted the auction warnings. He kept you completely in the dark while the bank seized the property to cover the massive margin calls he failed to pay. You have been living in a foreclosed home as a squatter for the better part of a year. You do not own the roof over your head. You do not own the ground you walk on. You own absolutely nothing. A raw, guttural sound escaped my mother's throat. She clutched her chest, swaying in her seat as if the physical weight of her newfound poverty had just crashed down upon her. She had spent her entire life looking down her nose at anyone she deemed financially inferior. She had mocked my small apartment when I was starting my business, calling me a peasant who lacked the Hayes family refinement. Now she was sitting in a public courtroom, realizing she was completely destitute. My father slowly turned his head to look at Preston. The sheer volume of rage radiating from Reginald was terrifying. "You let them take my home," my father growled, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, explosive anger. "You let the bank take my home, and you sat at my dining room table drinking my wine, pretending you were saving me." Preston backed away, holding his hands up defensively. "Reginald, you have to understand, the market liquidity was tied up. I was going to buy it back. I just needed to win this lawsuit to secure the capital. He was going to pay for his theft with my money. He had marched my father into this courthouse to steal my multi-million-dollar company so he could quietly repurchase the foreclosed house and pretend none of this ever happened. It was the most diabolical, parasitic scheme imaginable, and they had almost gotten away with it. But there is one final detail you should know about commercial auctions," I continued, refusing to let the chaos drown out my testimony. "When a prime suburban estate goes to auction, my acquisitions department receives an immediate notification. We monitor distressed assets across the entire metropolitan area. So when your home went on the auction block 8 months ago, it did not go to a stranger." I paused, making sure every single person in the room was hanging on my next word. "Hayes Urban Development purchased the defaulted note," I stated with absolute finality. "I paid off the debt Preston accrued. I hold the title to the house you are living in. I am your landlord. And considering you brought me to court to steal my life's work, I think it is time we discuss your immediate eviction." The courtroom completely erupted. The gallery gasped in unison. My sister Jasmine buried her face in her lap, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her ruined social status set in. She had no rich husband to save her. She had no wealthy father to fund her lifestyle. She had nothing but the designer scrubs on her back. My father looked as though he had been physically struck by lightning. The daughter he had spent 32 years calling an ugly, uneducated disappointment now owned the very bed he slept in. He was entirely at my mercy, and he knew he had never shown me a single ounce of mercy in his life. Judge Sterling hammered her gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but the sheer shockwave of the revelation made it impossible to silence the room immediately. She glared down at the plaintiff's table, where the opposing counsel was frantically packing his briefcase, clearly preparing to sprint out of the building the second court was adjourned. Mr. Hayes, Judge Sterling announced, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. This court has heard enough. You have brought a frivolous, malicious, and entirely fraudulent lawsuit before my bench. You attempted to use the judicial system to extort a successful business owner to cover the criminal financial negligence of your associate. She turned her fierce gaze toward Preston, who was currently trying to slip out the back doors of the courtroom. Bailiff Judge Sterling commanded, "Detain Mr. Caldwell. He is not leaving this courthouse until federal investigators arrive to collect him." Preston let out a pathetic yelp as two armed bailiffs grabbed his arms and forcefully escorted him to the holding area. His bespoke suit crumpled, his arrogant swagger completely erased by the harsh reality of handcuffs. I sat at the defense table feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. I had not yelled, I had not thrown a tantrum. I had simply brought receipts to a gunfight. My family had demanded I play my role as the scapegoat, but I had rewritten the entire script. The bailiffs had barely dragged Preston through the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom when the suffocating silence finally snapped. Reginald Hayes could not process the reality of his absolute defeat. For 32 years, he had dictated the reality of our family. He spoke and we obeyed. He demanded and we delivered. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control and supreme financial authority. The realization that I not only held the deed to his historic estate, but also possessed the unilateral power to evict him onto the street completely broke whatever fragile psychological dam was holding his ego together. He shoved his heavy wooden chair back so violently it crashed to the polished courtroom floor with a deafening thud. He stood up, his massive frame shaking with a terrifying, unhinged fury. "You set me up!" my father roared, his booming voice rattling the microphone on the witness stand. He completely ignored the basic rules of courtroom decorum, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You knew the bank was taking the house and you said absolutely nothing. You let your own blood drown so you could swoop in and steal the property from under my feet." The sheer audacity of his pivot was breathtaking. It was a masterclass in narcissistic deflection. He had just been exposed for attempting to steal half of my company to cover his reckless gambling debts. He had been caught sitting by silently while his white knight plotted to bulldoze a century of our black family history to build a strip mall. Yet in his twisted reality, my refusal to save him from the consequences of his own actions was the ultimate betrayal. He had to make me the villain because confronting his own colossal failure would shatter his mind. Judge Sterling slammed her gavel, demanding order, but my father was entirely lost to his rage. He took a step toward the aisle, his chest heaving. "You had $42 million, he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of greed and desperation. "You sat on a fortune while I was drowning in debt. You watched me struggle to maintain this family's good name, and you hid your wealth. If you had just done your duty as a daughter and turned over your profits to the family trust, none of this would have happened. You made me do this, Charmaine. Your secrecy forced my hand." I remained perfectly still in the witness box. Malik stood up to object to the outburst, but I held up my hand, signaling him to stop. I wanted my father to speak. I wanted the court, the gallery, and the public record to absorb every single word of his delusion. I wanted his absolute refusal to take accountability cemented in the official transcript. "I did not make you do anything, Reginald," I said, my voice carrying a cold, clinical precision that cut straight through his screaming. "I did not force you to mortgage your grandfather's estate to pay for country club dues and luxury cars. I did not force you to sign over power of attorney to a man currently under federal investigation. And I certainly did not force you to march into this courthouse and commit perjury." "You are a thief," he yelled, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple. Two armed bailiffs immediately moved toward him, placing their hands on their utility belts, ready to tackle him to the ground if he took one more step toward the front of the room. "You stole my home, and you are trying to humiliate me in front of the entire city." I leaned closer to the microphone. "I bought a foreclosed property from a bank," I corrected him smoothly. "A bank that was preparing to evict you months ago. I did not steal your home. You surrendered it when you chose to prioritize social climbing over fiscal responsibility. You claim I hid my wealth, but the truth is, You never once bothered to ask about my life. If you had spent 5 minutes treating me like a human being instead of an embarrassment, you would have known exactly what I was building. You dug your own grave, Dad. I just bought the cemetery. Judge Sterling had seen enough. Bailiff, she commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Remove Mr. Hayes from my courtroom. If he speaks one more word, I will hold him in criminal contempt, and he will spend the next 30 days in the county jail. The bailiffs grabbed my father by the arms. For a brief second, he tried to resist pulling against their grip, but the reality of the badges and the handcuffs quickly drained the fight out of him. He looked at me as they dragged him backward down the aisle, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. He had no power left. His booming voice meant nothing. His threats were entirely toothless. He was just a broke, desperate old man being thrown out of a building. As the doors swung shut behind my father, the vacuum of his absence was immediately filled by a sharp theatrical wail from the plaintiff's table. Jasmine could not handle the destruction of her safety net. Her entire life was funded by the very estate I now owned. The realization that she was facing impending poverty, not to mention a very real perjury charge, completely shattered her pristine facade. She jumped up from her seat, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. The designer medical scrubs she had worn to project authority now just looked like a ridiculous costume. Tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup as she unleashed a hysterical screech that echoed off the high ceilings. "You planned this!" Jasmine screamed, pointing a shaking manicured finger at me. "You orchestrated this entire thing just to ruin my life." I sat back in the witness chair, crossing my legs and folding my hands comfortably in my lap. I watched my older sister, the golden child, unravel in real time. "You were always so jealous of me," she sobbed loudly, gesturing wildly toward the empty space where Preston had been standing moments before. "You hated that I went to medical school. You hated that I married a successful man. You set Preston up. You manipulated the bank, and you probably tipped off the federal investigators just to humiliate my husband and destroy my marriage." The sheer scale of her delusion was almost impressive. She genuinely believed that my multi-million-dollar real estate empire, the late nights, the grueling construction projects, the endless financial modeling had all been a decades-long con designed exclusively to embarrass her. She could not fathom a world where my life did not revolve entirely around her. Jasmine, Judge Sterling warned, her tone dangerously sharp. "Sit down immediately. You are already facing severe penalties for lying under oath in my courtroom. Do not add contempt to your charges." Jasmine ignored the judge, completely lost in her narcissistic spiral. She gripped the edge of the wooden table, crying hysterically. "You stole my father's house so you could throw me on the street. You want me to be a failure just like you. You want me to be the ugly sister who has nothing. You are a monster, Charmaine. You are a cold, heartless monster." My mother rushed forward, trying to grab Jasmine by the arms to pull her back into her seat, but my sister shoved her away. My mother looked around the courtroom with wild, terrified eyes, realizing that their social destruction was complete. Every prominent member of their church, every society friend who had come to watch my downfall, was currently witnessing the Hayes family completely self-destruct. I looked at Jasmine, watching the tears drip off her chin. I felt no anger toward her anymore. Anger required emotional investment. I only felt a profound, overwhelming pity for a woman who had never developed a single coping mechanism because she had never been told no. "I did not orchestrate your husband's federal securities fraud, Jasmine," I said, my voice projecting a calm, steady rhythm that contrasted perfectly with her frantic screaming. "I did not force him to gamble away millions of dollars. And I certainly did not force you to lie on the witness stand about being in your clinic when you were actually drinking champagne on a yacht in Italy. You and Preston ruined your own marriage. I simply bought the wreckage." She opened her mouth to scream another accusation, but the words choked in her throat. She looked at the judge, who was signaling the remaining bailiff to approach. She looked at her lawyer, who was actively packing his briefcase and refusing to make eye contact with her. She finally looked at me, and the truth hit her with the force of a freight train. There was no one left to save her. There was no father to write a check. There was no wealthy husband to hide behind. She was entirely alone, facing the very real consequences of her own terrible choices. Jasmine collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her arms and unleashing a loud, ugly sob that filled the silent courtroom. The golden child had no gold left. The pedestal my parents had built for her was completely demolished. I turned my attention back to Judge Sterling, feeling the crisp air of the courtroom fill my lungs. The toxic chains that had bound me to this family for 32 years were finally permanently severed. The heavy wooden gavel slammed against the sounding block with a force that rattled the microphones. Judge Sterling struck it a second time, then a third, the sharp cracks echoing like gunshots across the high ceilings of the Fulton County courthouse. "Bailiffs, halt right there!" Judge Sterling commanded, her voice booming with an absolute terrifying authority that instantly paralyzed every person in the room. "Bring them back before the bench. Both of them. If I am submitting this circus to the district attorney, they will stand here and face the official record." The armed officers paused near the heavy double doors. They turned my father and Preston around, marching them back toward the plaintiff's table. Reginald moved like a man walking to the electric chair, his massive shoulders slumped, his chest heaving with defeated, ragged breaths. Preston stumbled alongside him, his bespoke suit wrinkled and damp with nervous sweat, his arrogant swagger entirely replaced by the frantic twitching of a trapped animal. Jasmine choked on her own sobs and sank lower into her chair, utterly terrified of drawing the judge's wrath. "If anyone in this gallery or at these tables breathes a word out of turn, I will hold you in criminal contempt and you will spend the weekend in the county jail," Judge Sterling warned, her dark eyes sweeping the room. The absolute silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents and the frantic, shallow breathing of the men standing before the bench. Counselor Judge Sterling said, pointing a finger directly at Malik. "Hand the clerk the full foreclosure and auction documentation immediately. I want to see the paper trail." Malik did not hesitate. He walked to the clerk's desk and handed over a thick, bound stack of certified banking records. The clerk passed them up to the judge. The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Sterling opened the file. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched the judge's eyes dart back and forth across the pages. With every passing second, her expression grew darker. The lines around her mouth deepened into a scowl of pure judicial disgust. She was looking at the intercepted default notices that Preston had buried. She was looking at the multiple warnings from the bank addressed to Reginald Hayes, which Preston had rerouted to his own office to ensure my father remained completely in the dark. She was looking at a textbook case of fiduciary fraud unfolding in black and white ink. She flipped to the final section of the packet, which detailed the public auction of the Savannah estate. She traced her pen along the lines denoting the final sale price and the transfer of the deed. While the judge read, the reality of the situation was crushing the men standing at the plaintiff's table. Preston, sweating so profusely that dark patches had formed under the arms of his custom-tailored suit, leaned frantically toward my father. His mind was scrambling for a lifeline, still entirely convinced that money and his white privilege could buy him out of any consequence. "Reginald, listen to me," Preston whispered, his voice shaking, but loud enough to carry through the dead silent courtroom. "We can fix this. This is just a minor liquidity issue. Do not panic. I have access to an emergency capital reserve through my firm's offshore accounts. We will just buy the estate back from the bank on Monday morning. I will personally authorize the wire transfer. We will get the house back and handle Charmaine later." My father slowly turned his head to look at Preston. There was a hollow, empty void in Reginald's eyes. He had spent decades worshipping at the altar of men exactly like Preston, assuming their proximity to wealth made them invincible. But even my father, blinded by his own toxic pride, could see the absolute desperation radiating from his former son-in-law. Judge Sterling stopped reading. She slowly lowered her pen and removed her reading glasses, letting them rest on the towering stack of evidence. She looked down from the bench, fixing Preston with a stare so bewildered and deeply disdainful that it seemed to strip the very skin from his bones. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Sterling said, her voice dry and laced with razor-sharp mockery, "did you just attempt to promise your former father-in-law that you would use your firm's capital to repurchase this property from the bank?" Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, Your Honor. We have the liquid assets to rectify this misunderstanding immediately and make the bank whole. You cannot buy it from the bank, Judge Sterling stated flatly, letting the words hang in the air for maximum impact. The bank does not own the Savannah estate. They divested themselves of the property entirely. It was purchased at a private auction last month by an anonymous holding company. Preston blinked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Then I will track down the holding company and make them an aggressive offer above market value. We will buy it from them. I shifted in my chair, uncrossing my legs, and leaned forward slightly so I was in Preston's direct line of sight. I offered him a bright, cold, and utterly merciless smile. The holding company is registered in Delaware, I said, my voice carrying a smooth conversational tone that echoed perfectly through the quiet room. It is called Golden Child Acquisitions, LLC. And as the sole managing member of that entity, I can assure you the property is definitely not for sale. My father let out a ragged, gasping breath, clutching the edge of the table to keep his knees from buckling. The sheer poetry of the holding company's name hit him squarely in the chest. I had bought his beloved legacy with cash, shielded it behind a corporate veil, named after his favorite daughter, and locked him out of his own history permanently. You do not have the capital for that, Preston stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me and the judge. You are lying. You could not possibly afford the cash auction price for an estate of that magnitude. Judge Sterling picked up the final page of the document and held it up. The certified transfer of funds clears the defendant perfectly, Mr. Caldwell. The holding company purchased the estate in full without financing. Ms. Hayes owns the property free and clear. And based on the federal investigation currently surrounding your firm, I highly doubt you possess the capital to buy a cup of coffee, let alone negotiate a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction. Preston's jaw clamped shut. The realization finally anchored itself in his mind. He was completely out of moves. The bank could not save him. His firm could not save him. His privilege had run out, and the federal agents waiting outside the courtroom doors were the only future he had left. I sat back and adjusted my cuffs. I had come to court today, prepared to defend my business against a frivolous attack. Instead, I had successfully executed a total liquidation of my family's toxic empire. They had walked into the courthouse as the wealthy, untouchable elite. They were walking out as homeless broke and federally investigated frauds. The plaintiff's lawyer, still sweating profusely and visibly trembling, scrambled to pick up the deed transfer documents Malik had just provided. He squinted at the fine print, his brow furrowing in profound confusion as his hands shook. He looked from the papers to Judge Sterling, then back to my table, his entire legal strategy having evaporated into thin air. What anonymous holding company? The lawyer asked, his voice cracking under the suffocating tension of the room. You just said Golden Child Acquisitions bought the debt, but the primary corporate seal on this bank transfer says something else entirely. The parent entity is shielded. I did not look at the lawyer. I turned my gaze slowly and deliberately back to my father. He was still gripping the wooden table, his knuckles bone-white, waiting for a punchline that was never going to come. I leaned directly into the microphone, ensuring my voice resonated with absolute crystal-clear authority across the cavernous room. Horizon Acquisitions. Dad, I stated, letting the name hang heavily in the dead silence of the courtroom. Golden Child is just the subsidiary shell I created specifically for this one transaction. The parent company funding it, the corporate entity that holds the ultimate deed to your beloved historic estate, is Horizon Acquisitions, the exact same company you just spent the last hour on the stand calling a rundown shack-selling disappointment. The realization hit Reginald Hayes like a physical blow to the chest. His eyes widened and his mouth fell open as the supreme punishing irony of his situation finally clicked into place. The business he had relentlessly mocked, the firm he had outright refused to co-sign a basic commercial loan for the enterprise he had just sworn under oath was a failing amateur gamble, was the exact same corporate entity that had swallowed his entire generational legacy whole. You called my properties dirt. I continued, my voice unwavering and razor-sharp. You sat there in your custom suit and told this judge that I lacked the education, the discipline, and the sophistication to manage real wealth. You proudly announced that I needed a privileged white fraudster to step in and save me from myself. But my rundown shack selling company generated enough liquid capital to buy your debt in straight cash. I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of my financial dominance sink into his skull. I did not even have to leverage a single one of my urban developments to do it, I told him, keeping my eyes locked on his crumbling posture. I bought your historic estate with the spare operating capital from my last fiscal quarter. I bought the roof over your head with the change left over from the businesses you called an embarrassment. My father's massive frame seemed to physically shrink inside his tailored suit. The booming, authoritative church deacon was completely gone. In his place sat a hollow, broken old man who had just been publicly eviscerated by his own staggering arrogance. He had spent my entire life looking down his nose at me, telling me I would end up on the streets without his grace and financial backing. Now the undeniable, certified truth was sitting on the judge's desk for the public record. Without my grace, he was the one without a place to live. I stood up from the defense table, buttoning my emerald green blazer with a crisp, deliberate motion. I looked down at him, refusing to offer even a fraction of the mercy he had denied me for 32 years. "You wanted half of my empire, Dad," I said, my tone ice-cold and absolute. "You dragged me into a court of law to steal my life's work just to fund Jasmine's lavish lifestyle and cover Preston's federal crimes. You thought you could bully me into submission because I am your daughter. But you brought a knife to a corporate war. I do not just own your house. I own the land it sits on. I own the iron gates you drive through, and starting tomorrow morning you have exactly 30 days to vacate my property before I have the county sheriff remove your belongings to the curb." My mother let out a loud, pathetic wail from the gallery. She clutched Jasmine's arm as if her golden child could somehow conjure a miracle to fix this absolute catastrophe. But Jasmine was completely catatonic. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding that the dark-skinned, quiet sister she had bullied and belittled her entire life was now the undisputed architect of their ruin. The financial umbilical cord she had lived on was permanently severed, and her medical scrubs could not shield her from the impending poverty. Malik sat back in his chair, quietly organizing his legal pads with a faint, satisfied smile. We had not just won the case, we had executed a flawless surgical demolition of my abusers. Judge Sterling had seen and heard enough. She gathered the heavily documented evidence, tapping the stack sharply against her desk to align the edges. The sound brought a final, chilling sense of closure to the room. "The plaintiff's case is dismissed with extreme prejudice," Judge Sterling announced, her voice booming with finality. "Mr. Hayes, you have abused the judicial system, perjured yourself on my stand, and attempted to commit egregious financial extortion against your own daughter to cover up massive fiduciary fraud. You are extraordinarily lucky that Ms. Hayes has chosen to simply evict you today rather than file federal countercharges for your attempted theft." Judge Sterling turned her fierce attention to the bailiffs waiting by the heavy wooden doors. "Remove Mr. Caldwell from my courtroom and transfer him directly to federal custody," she commanded. "And escort the plaintiff and his family out of this building immediately. We are adjourned." The sharp, echoing crack of the gavel finalized the total destruction of my father's reign. The bailiffs yanked Preston to his feet, hauling the protesting, profusely sweating fraudster toward the holding cells where he belonged. Another set of armed officers moved toward my father's table, gesturing firmly toward the exit. Reginald Hayes stood up on shaky, unstable legs. He did not yell this time. He did not threaten me. He did not try to exert his phantom authority. He simply looked at me, a defeated, utterly ruined man, before turning around and walking heavily up the aisle. I watched them leave, surrounded by the whispers, gasps, and harsh judgment of the very high society friends they had sacrificed everything to impress. I stood tall in the quiet courtroom, knowing I had finally taken back every ounce of power they had ever stolen from me. As the heavy oak doors of Judge Sterling's courtroom swung shut behind the departing bailiffs, my father remained rooted to his chair at the plaintiff table. The booming dismissal from the bench had finalized his legal ruin, but the psychological devastation was still washing over him in real time. All the blood had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His hands shook violently as he stared blindly at the polished wood in front of him. The reality of the situation was hitting Reginald Hayes like a runaway freight train. The daughter he had spent 3 decades treating like an unsightly blemish on his pristine family portrait was not just fiercely independent. She was a multi-millionaire real estate mogul who had effortlessly outmaneuvered his highly paid legal team and his supposedly genius son-in-law. He realized in that suffocating moment that I did not just have more money than him. I had all the money. I owed him absolutely nothing, and infinitely worse, I was now his landlord. I did not pack my briefcase right away. I signaled for Malik to hand me the final piece of paperwork we had prepared for this exact scenario. I walked slowly across the aisle, my heels clicking against the floorboards, until I stood directly over my father. He slowly raised his head to look at me, and for the first time in my entire life, there was no condescension in his eyes. There was no booming authority. There was only pure, unadulterated terror. "I believe we have some landlord and tenant business to conclude," I said, my voice perfectly level. I dropped the heavy manila envelope directly onto his trembling hands. "This is your formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises," I instructed, letting the absolute finality of my words sink into his bones. "It outlines the exact condition the property must be in when you hand over the keys. If a single fixture is missing, or a single wall is damaged out of spite, I will deduct it from the $0 you currently have to your name, and I will sue you for the remainder." My mother finally found her voice. She reached across the table, her hands shaking wildly as she tried to grasp my arm. "Charmaine, please, you cannot do this. We are your parents. You cannot put us out on the street like common criminals. Think of the community. Think of the church. What will people say when they find out you evicted your own family?" I stepped back easily, avoiding her frantic grasp. "The church cannot pay your mortgage, Mom," I replied coldly. "And you are not my parents. You are the people who funded a lavish wedding for a man who is currently on his way to federal lockup while actively trying to bankrupt me in open court. You made your choices based entirely on social climbing and optics. Now you get to experience the absolute bottom of the social ladder you care so much about. Let the community talk. I highly doubt they will pity a man who tried to steal his daughter's company to cover his gambling debts." Jasmine, who had been hyperventilating in her chair, suddenly stood up. The golden child was entirely stripped of her gold. She looked at me with red, puffy eyes, her designer medical scrubs stained with mascara and tears. "Where are we supposed to go?" she sobbed, her voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Preston's accounts are frozen. The clinic's lease is under his firm's name. I have nothing left, Charmaine. You took everything from me." "I took absolutely nothing from you, Jasmine," I corrected her without a single shred of pity. "You hitched your wagon to a fraud because you cared more about having a rich husband than a decent one. You mocked my work ethic because you thought your proximity to his wealth made you superior. You stood on that witness stand today and tried to have me committed as an unstable liability just so you could keep funding your luxury vacations. Now you have to figure out how to survive on your own merit. I suggest you start looking for an affordable apartment. I hear the rental market is brutal this time of year, but I am sure you will figure it out." I turned my attention back to my father. He had not spoken a single word since I dropped the eviction notice onto his lap. His silence was the ultimate victory. The booming patriarch who had terrorized my childhood with his impossible demands and his conditional love was completely broken. His towering ego was shattered beyond repair, reduced to rubble by the very daughter he swore would amount to nothing. "You have exactly 30 days, Dad," I reminded him, my tone final and absolute. "You have a massive historic estate filled with 30 years of expensive garbage you bought to impress people who do not care about you. I suggest you start packing tonight. Do not make me call the county sheriff to physically remove your belongings to the curb. It would be a terrible look for a deacon." I turned my back on them and walked out of the courtroom with Malik by my side. Pushing open the heavy double doors and stepping out into the bright Atlanta afternoon, I took a deep, cleansing breath of fresh air. I had walked into that building as a target expected to bow down and surrender my life's work to a family that despised me. I was walking out as the undisputed owner of my family's legacy, the protector of my own empire, and the sole architect of my absolute freedom. I stood in the expansive marble corridor of the courthouse, watching the heavy oak doors swing shut behind me. The afternoon sun streamed through the high arched windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Malik walked beside me, his briefcase secure in his grip, but I stopped before we reached the elevators. I was not completely done. Winning the civil case and defending my business from their predatory lawsuit was only the first phase of this extraction. I did not just want to win the legal battle. I needed to completely clean house. The Savannah estate was not just a single residential building. It was a sprawling compound that included a massive custom-built guest house spanning over 6,000 square feet. For the last 4 years, Jasmine and Preston had occupied that secondary mansion entirely rent-free. They had used the pristine, manicured grounds to host lavish garden parties, posing for local society magazines, and pretending they were the epitome of self-made Atlanta elites. In reality, they were nothing more than glorified squatters draining resources from a patriarch who was quietly drowning in catastrophic debt. They had lived a life of absolute luxury on my father's dime, and now that the deed belonged to me, their free ride was officially over. The courtroom doors opened again, and the remaining members of my family spilled out into the hallway. My father was leaning heavily against the stone wall, looking like a ghost of the man who had confidently marched into the building that morning. My mother was clutching her purse to her chest, her eyes darting around the public space as if terrified the local paparazzi were hiding behind the marble columns. And then there was Jasmine. She was shaking her perfectly styled hair disheveled, still crying over the fact that her husband had just been hauled away in federal handcuffs. I walked slowly back toward them. The sharp clicking of my heels echoed down the corridor, forcing them to look up. Jasmine shrank back against our mother, but I did not stop until I was standing less than 2 feet away from her. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer. I bypassed the business cards and the corporate pens, retrieving exactly what I had come here to deliver. I pulled out a thick folded packet of official court-stamped documents. The vivid red ink of the county clerk's seal glared brightly against the crisp white paper. You spent the entire morning sitting on a witness stand, diagnosing me as a struggling, unstable liability. I said, my voice carrying a calm, lethal clarity that made Jasmine flinch. You told a federal judge that I lacked the discipline to manage real wealth, while you paraded around in designer scrubs pretending your fraudulent husband was a financial savior. Let me give you a very quick practical lesson in how real wealth operates. I thrust the packet of papers directly into her chest, forcing her to bring her hands up to catch it before it hit the floor. Those are official certified eviction notices, I stated, letting the absolute finality of the words sink into her brain. They are stamped, verified, and actively filed with the county sheriff's department. You and Preston have been living in my guest house rent-free for 8 months. You have been hosting your little society brunches and drinking imported champagne on property that was bought and paid for by the rundown shack-selling company you just mocked in open court. Jasmine stared down at the documents, her hands trembling so violently the papers rustled. She looked at the bold black lettering at the top of the page, confirming the writ of possession. You cannot do this. Charmaine Jasmine choked out her voice, breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. Preston is gone. They took him. I do not have access to our accounts. I do not have anywhere to put my things. You cannot throw your own sister out on the street. I can, and I absolutely will, I corrected her smoothly. You hitched your entire identity to a man who stole from our father to cover his day trading losses. You willingly participated in a scheme to steal 50% of my commercial real estate firm, so you could maintain your fake aristocratic lifestyle. You do not get to play the victim now that the check has finally bounced. My mother stepped forward, her face pale and streaked with tears. Charmaine, please have some mercy. She is completely alone. She needs time to figure out her clinical practice and her finances. Mercy is a privilege reserved for people who demonstrate basic human decency, I replied, not breaking eye contact with my sister. You have exactly 30 days, Jasmine. 30 days to pack up your designer clothes, your expensive furniture, and your fake prestige. If you are not completely vacated from my guest house by the end of the month, I will have the authorities physically remove you, and everything you own will be left on the curb for the neighborhood to see." Jasmine let out a sharp, devastated sob, covering her face with her hands. The golden child was finally being forced to step out into the real world without a financial safety net to catch her. There would be no more free rent. There would be no more using the family estate to secure her social climbing. "And Jasmine," I added, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper, "the property managers will be conducting a thorough walkthrough on the 31st day. If a single light fixture is missing, if a single wall is damaged out of spite, or if you attempt to strip the guest house of any structural assets before you leave, I will press criminal charges for vandalism and property theft. Do not test me. You have already seen what happens when you underestimate my infrastructure." I did not wait for her to respond. I did not need to hear another excuse or another desperate plea for unearned sympathy. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family, leaving them standing in the cold marble hallway of the courthouse. They had nothing left to say and absolutely nothing left to steal. Malik pushed the elevator button, and the stainless steel doors slid open with a quiet chime. We stepped inside together. As the doors slowly closed, I caught one final glimpse of my father staring blankly at the floor, my mother weeping quietly, and my sister clutching her eviction notice like a death sentence. The doors sealed shut, cutting them off from my view completely. I pressed the button for the lobby, feeling the elevator descend, and knowing with absolute certainty that I was finally rising above them forever. As the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of my ruined family, I leaned back against the stainless steel wall and let out a long breath. I looked over at Malik, who was sliding a crisp white document with a heavy blue judicial stamp into his leather briefcase. While I had been in the hallway delivering the eviction notices to my sister, Malik had remained inside the courtroom for 3 crucial minutes to execute the final devastating phase of our strategy. I had promised to completely clean house, and my lawyer was not a man who left loose ends. He had approached the bench right before Judge Sterling fully adjourned the session. It was not enough to simply mention Preston Caldwell's federal investigation during cross-examination to win the civil case. Malik wanted the absolute destruction of Preston's career cemented into the permanent public record. He formally submitted a secondary heavily bound evidentiary binder directly to the court clerk. It contained every single unredacted financial log wire transfer receipt and offshore crypto ledger my acquisitions department had uncovered during our audit of Caldwell Wealth Management. We did not just prove Preston lied about possessing the deed to the Savannah estate. We provided the court with the exact dates, times, and routing numbers he used to illegally siphon collateral from my father's accounts to cover his catastrophic day trading losses. We handed the court the smoking gun, the fingerprints, and the detailed map of his entire embezzlement scheme. Judge Sterling had accepted the binder with a grim expression. She was a jurist who despised having her courtroom treated like a playground for entitled fraudsters. She did not just enter the documents into the civil docket to die in a dusty filing cabinet. She immediately flagged the entire submission for a formal judicial referral to the authorities. She signed a direct order, handing our evidentiary findings straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Prosecutor's Office. That single signature from a sitting judge was the ultimate kill shot. It was a death sentence for Preston's entire professional existence. In the world of high-level wealth management, reputation and regulatory compliance are the only currencies that matter. By forcing that evidence onto the official court record, Malik ensured that Preston could never quietly settle his federal investigation behind closed doors. The judicial referral triggered an automatic, irreversible cascade of professional ruin. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority would permanently revoke his Series 7 and Series 63 licenses. He would be barred for life from acting as a broker, investment advisor, or fiduciary in any capacity. Preston Caldwell, the smug, arrogant man who had sat on the witness stand and called me an uneducated girl playing Monopoly with family funds, was now permanently blacklisted from the financial sector. He would never legally touch another client's portfolio for the rest of his life. His firm, Caldwell Wealth Management, would implode by Monday morning. The moment the judicial referral hit the regulatory databases, his partners would panic, investors would initiate mass withdrawals, and the firm's assets would be frozen by federal regulators to pay restitution to the clients he had defrauded. He had marched into that courtroom dripping with unearned privilege, expecting his pedigree to shield him from basic accountability. He thought he could bulldoze a historic black family estate to save his own skin simply because he believed he was inherently superior to the people he was robbing. Now he was sitting in a federal holding cell, stripped of his licenses, stripped of his wealth, and stripped of the very career he had weaponized against me. I watched the floor numbers count down on the elevator display, feeling a profound electric sense of satisfaction. My father had literally sold his soul and his legacy to a man who was now a radioactive pariah in the business world. Reginald Hayes had sacrificed his own daughter to protect his proximity to a wealthy white son-in-law, only to discover that the wealth was entirely fraudulent and the son-in-law was a common thief. They had tied their entire social standing to a sinking ship, and I had just handed the authorities the anchor. The elevator chimed softly as we reached the ground floor lobby of the courthouse. The doors opened to reveal the bustling, bright expanse of the building's main entrance. Lawyers, clients, and clerks hurried past us, entirely unaware of the absolute massacre that had just taken place in Judge Sterling's courtroom. Malik turned to me as we walked toward the glass exit doors, his professional composure breaking into a rare, genuine smile. He tapped his briefcase where the stamped judicial referral was safely tucked away. "He is finished, Charmaine. The SEC will freeze whatever assets he has left by tomorrow. He will be lucky if he avoids a 10-year federal prison sentence, but even if he manages a plea deal, he will be bagging groceries for the rest of his life. No financial institution will ever let him pass their lobby." I nodded, stepping through the doors and out into the warm Atlanta afternoon. The sun was shining brightly, casting a golden glow over the city streets. I took a deep breath of the fresh air, feeling the immense, crushing weight of 32 years of family toxicity finally dissolve into nothing. I had not just survived their abuse. I had systematically, legally, and financially eradicated their power over me. I was leaving the courthouse as a multi-million-dollar real estate mogul, while the people who had tried to destroy me were left to drown in the ruin of their own making. It was the purest, most flawless victory I could have ever engineered. The sharp clicking of my heels on the polished marble floor of the courthouse lobby was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of victory. Malik and I were merely 50 feet from the revolving glass doors and the warm Atlanta sun when the frantic, echoing sound of heavy footsteps rushing behind us shattered the peace. I did not need to turn around to know who was chasing me. The desperate, uneven gait belonged to people whose entire world had just collapsed. "Charmaine, wait," a raspy, winded voice called out. I stopped and turned slowly. Reginald Hayes, the towering patriarch who had just spent the entire morning trying to steal my life's work, was practically jogging toward me. Right behind him was Jasmine, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, her face stained with ruined makeup and sheer terror. The transformation was staggering. All the arrogance, the unearned superiority, the smug entitlement that had defined their existence for my entire life was completely gone. They looked hollow, reduced to the terrified reality of their impending poverty. My father closed the distance between us, stopping a few feet away. He was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead, his custom-tailored suit looking suddenly baggy and pathetic. He reached out a trembling hand as if to touch my arm, but Malik smoothly stepped forward, creating a physical barrier between us. Reginald dropped his hand, swallowing hard. "Charmaine, please." My father pleaded, his booming church deacon voice reduced to a pathetic, rattling whisper. "You cannot do this. You cannot throw us out on the street. We are your family. We are your blood. You have made your point. You won the case. But taking the house is too far. Your mother is sick with worry. Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at the man who had given me life and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no lingering desire for his approval. "My mother can move into a modest apartment," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. Or she can stay at a hotel, but she will not be staying on my property. And as for making my point, Dad, this is not a lesson or a negotiation. This is an eviction. Jasmine pushed past my father, tears streaming down her face. She looked like a cornered animal. Charmaine, you know? Preston left me with nothing. His firm is frozen. The federal agents seized our joint accounts. I do not have access to a single dollar. You have dozens of properties. You have $42 million. You cannot seriously evict your own sister from the guest house. Just let me stay there. I will stay out of your way. I promise. I just need a place to live. The sheer audacity of her request was breathtaking. Less than 2 hours ago, she had sat on a witness stand under oath and diagnosed me as an unstable, jealous liability. She had actively tried to convince a federal judge to strip me of my empire and hand it over to her fraudulent husband. Now, with the handcuffs locked around Preston's wrists, she was begging to live rent-free on the very estate she had tried to steal. I tilted my head, studying her desperate, tear-stained face. Jasmine, I said softly, delivering the reality check she had managed to avoid for her entire adult life. You are a licensed dermatologist. You have a medical degree that our parents paid for in cash. You have a career. You have an income. The fact that you spent all of it keeping up appearances and funding a fake aristocratic lifestyle is a personal failure, not a family emergency. I am not a charity, and you are not my dependent. You will pack your designer clothes, and you will vacate my guest house by the end of the month. My father stepped forward again, his eyes wide with a frantic, clinging desperation. Charmaine, what about loyalty? What about honor? God commands us to honor our mother and father. We gave you life. We raised you. We provided for you. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood when we need you the most. We are begging you, show some grace. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound bounced off the marble walls, cold and sharp. Grace, I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the word. You want grace. Where was your grace when I was sleeping on an air mattress in a dangerous neighborhood, eating canned soup, trying to scrape together funding for my first commercial property? Where was your family loyalty when you explicitly refused to co-sign my business loan, telling the bank I was an undisciplined embarrassment? Where was your honor when you drained your retirement accounts to pay for Jasmine's third lavish wedding instead of helping your other daughter build a future? Reginald flinched as if I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but I did not give him the oxygen. You walked into a court of law today and perjured yourself to steal my company. I continued, stepping closer to him, forcing him to look me dead in the eye. You sat on that stand and called me a struggling disappointment. You sat by silently while Preston outlined a plan to bulldoze your own grandfather's historic estate to build a strip mall just so you could clear your personal gambling debts. You were perfectly willing to completely destroy my life to save your own ego. You do not get to invoke family loyalty now that you have lost the war. You burned this bridge to ashes, Dad. Do not complain to me about the smoke. Jasmine let out a loud, pathetic sob. You are a monster. You have no heart. I turned my gaze to her, my expression utterly unyielding. No, Jasmine. I have boundaries. And for the first time in 32 years, I have the power to enforce them. You both thought my independence was a rebellion. You thought my quiet ambition was a joke. You expected me to bow down and surrender the moment you applied legal pressure because you genuinely believed I was weak. I adjusted my briefcase strap, feeling the immense, soaring weightlessness of absolute victory. I am the exact woman you forced me to become, I stated with absolute finality. I survived your financial neglect. I survived your emotional abuse. I survived your malicious lawsuit. I survived all of it without you, and I built an empire in the process. I owe you nothing. Not a dollar, not a guest house, and certainly not an apology. I turned my back on them. I did not wait to hear my father's next pathetic plea, nor did I stay to listen to my sister's hysterical crying. Malik walked beside me, his silent presence a testament to the ironclad legal fortress we had just erected around my life. We walked through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the brilliant, blinding light of the Atlanta afternoon. Behind me, the shadows of the courthouse swallowed my family whole, trapping them in the ruin of their own making. I walked toward my waiting car, leaving them entirely in the past, stepping forward into a future that belonged exclusively to me. I was halfway down the wide concrete steps of the Fulton County courthouse when the heavy revolving doors burst open behind me. The frantic scrambling of footsteps spilled out into the humid Atlanta air. "Charmaine, please wait." It was my mother's voice this time. It lacked the polished country club refinement she had spent decades perfecting. It was raw, shrill, and entirely pathetic. I stopped. I took a slow, deliberate breath of the warm air, letting the sheer absurdity of the moment wash over me. I turned around. Malik stopped beside me, a silent, immovable guard. My parents and my sister stood at the top of the stairs. They were physically looking down at me, but socially, financially, and morally, they were staring up from the absolute bottom of a very deep, very dark hole. "You want to talk about family?" I asked, projecting my voice just enough to cut through the ambient noise of the city streets. "You keep throwing that word at me like it is some kind of magical spell that will erase everything that happened inside that building." My mother wrung her hands together, her expensive jewelry clinking nervously. "We were misguided, Charmaine. Your father was under so much pressure. We panicked, but we can fix this. We can go back to being a family." I stared at her, feeling a profound sense of disgust. Family does not drag their own flesh and blood into a federal courthouse to steal their life's work. I stated my words, landing like physical blows. Family does not sit on a witness stand and commit perjury. Family does not quietly conspire to hand over a century of Black heritage to a privileged con artist just to cover up personal gambling debts. And family certainly does not steal from family. My father opened his mouth to interject, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. The time for his booming, authoritative lectures was permanently over. "You stood by and watched him try to destroy me today," I said, directing my fury back to my mother. "You nodded along while Jasmine called me an unstable liability. You wanted to see me ruined, Mom. You all did. You prayed for my downfall. You actively rooted for my failure because my independence threatened your fragile egos. You needed me to be the struggling, pathetic younger sister so you could feel better about your own empty, debt-funded lives. But God did not answer your prayers. He answered my hard work." Jasmine took a step forward, her face blotchy and red. "Charmaine, you have millions of dollars. You do not need the guest house. You do not need to do this to us. We will have nowhere to go." I looked at my older sister, the woman who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. I refused to be the savior to the exact people who handed the executioner the axe. I told her, my voice dropping to a cold, unyielding register. "I will not fund your redemption. I will not pay for your mistakes. I am not your safety net, and I am not your bank. I owe you absolutely nothing." I turned my gaze to include all three of them. "You have 30 days. Spend less time crying on public staircases and more time packing your bags. Do not ever contact me again." I turned my back on them for the absolute final time. I walked down the remaining steps with perfect, unbothered posture. At the curb, my driver Marcus was already waiting. He stood beside my sleek, custom black luxury SUV, holding the rear passenger door open for me. As I reached the pavement, the inevitable implosion began behind me. Without my money to save them, they had nothing left to do but turn on each other like starving wolves. I heard Jasmine's voice crack as she shrieked at my father, blaming him for trusting Preston and losing the estate. I heard my father bellow back, cursing Jasmine for bringing a federal fraudster into their home and destroying the family name. My mother's wails pitched higher, begging them to stop fighting in public, terrified of the pedestrians and court clerks who were now stopping to stare at the wealthy Hayes family tearing each other to shreds on the courthouse steps. I did not look back. I did not care who won their pathetic shouting match. I slid into the quiet, pristine interior of my vehicle. The plush leather seats embraced me. The cool air conditioning washed over my skin instantly, soothing the residual heat of the afternoon. Marcus closed the heavy door with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly silencing the chaotic screaming outside. Malik got into the front passenger seat, opening his laptop to finalize the eviction paperwork. I looked out the dark, tinted window. Through the glass, I watched my father throw his hands up in defeat, while my sister stomped her foot like a spoiled toddler. They were trapped in a hell of their own making, chained to the very debts and lies they had created. They had spent their entire lives obsessing over appearances, and now their absolute ruin was on public display for the entire city of Atlanta to witness. As Marcus pulled the SUV smoothly away from the curb, merging into the vibrant flow of the downtown traffic, I leaned back and closed my eyes. I felt a profound electric sense of peace settle over my chest. I had walked into that courthouse expecting a brutal, grueling battle for my business. I had expected to fight tooth and nail just to keep the lights on at my commercial properties. But I had walked out with something infinitely more valuable than a legal victory. I didn't just win a lawsuit today, I bought my freedom. The ultimate lesson here is that sharing DNA does not entitle anyone to your hard-earned success, peace, or sanity. Sometimes the most toxic people in your life are the ones sitting at your Thanksgiving table. Charmaine's journey teaches us that financial independence and meticulous receipts are your absolute best armor against manipulation. When family chooses to weaponize your past and mock your quiet ambitions, let them. Put your head down, build your empire in silence, and let your undeniable success be the gavel that silences their disrespect. True freedom isn't just surviving their abuse, it's buying the very ground they stand on. If this story empowered you to finally stop shrinking yourself for toxic relatives, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your story in the comments below to claim your own peace.